Brandon Cole's mansion, the billionaire tech mogul, gleamed as if it were daytime. Exclusive invitations, strict dress code, security guards at every corner. The whole city knew. To enter there was a sign of power, or of being useful to power. At the side gate, where the music reached faintly like an echo, a white van pulled up discreetly. The door slid open, and out stepped Ruth Williams, 48 years old, her hands marked by hot ovens and burnt sugar. She wore a simple dress, comfortable shoes, her hair tied back. She carried a thermal box and another cardboard one, scribbled in blue pen, "Ruth's Sweets, made with faith." The guard checked his clipboard, scanned the catering company name, and raised an eyebrow. "Delivery?" "Yes, sir. Homemade desserts for the sweets table." "The coordinator called last minute," Ruth answered, with a smile rehearsing courage. He let her through, not out of kindness, but because the event demanded perfection. Ruth walked down a service corridor where staff moved like silent shadows. With each tray that passed, she thought of the rent, her mother's medicine, her son's school supplies. Her heartbeat marched steady, like someone walking with a purpose beyond her own body. "Are you Ruth?" asked a woman with a clipboard. Her eyes hurried. "Yes. I brought the sweet potato mini pies and pecan brownies." "Set them there." She pointed with her pen, without looking up. Ruth opened the box with an almost maternal care. The scent of cinnamon and brown sugar blended with vanilla. Each dessert had been born at dawn, between whispered prayers and strong coffee. It wasn't just food, it was hope baked into a recipe. "Who made these?" asked an assistant, tasting a crumb that had fallen from the pan. "God and two tired hands," Ruth replied with gentle humor. The coordinator finally looked at the table. Her trained eye softened for a second. "They look beautiful." "Thank you, but—" And her pen pointed toward the main hall. "Mr. Cole is particular. He wants to see everything before it goes to the guests' table. Can you take a sample tray there?" Ruth swallowed hard. The main hall. Not a place for someone who entered through the back. But the chance to get her name into the circle of elite events could pay a whole month of bills. "I can. Before we continue, I'd love to know where you're watching from today. And if you're enjoying these stories, make sure you're subscribed to the channel." Ruth prepared a mirrored tray. On it, rows of mini pies tied with simple ribbons and cards labeled "Ruth's Sweets." Her hands trembled slightly. She took a deep breath. "God, guide these steps," she murmured. She walked through a corridor that ended at tall glass doors, where golden light spilled through like perfume. On the other side, the paradise of the wealthy. A string quartet played Sinatra, women in gowns that shimmered like constellations, men in suits worth more than a car. Laughter, toasts, and business promises floated like coins in the air. Ruth entered slowly. The tray shook less. Her gaze hardened. She wasn't here to beg for favor. She came to deliver work. The camera followed her steps from below, elevating her dignity. Some eyes landed on her. The polite ones looked away. The honest ones judged. The cruel ones laughed inside. A lady muttered without moving her lips. "Who are they hiring now?" "Doesn't matter, as long as she serves well," her friend replied, sipping. Ruth pretended not to hear. She remembered her mother's words. "Daughter, when they humiliate your skin, remember that God knows your name." She straightened her back. Near the bar, a group of young men laughed about cars, investments, trips. Among them, a boy in a blue suit, eyes lost, fidgeted with his watch. Evan Cole, 16, Brandon's only son. There was an old weariness in his eyes, the kind born under spotlights that never go out. "Evan, try this," a friend urged, pushing a glass. "I'm fine. My father's here," he answered, glancing around. "Your father's always here." The other laughed. Evan slipped away from the group and moved closer to the music. He saw Ruth for a moment. He saw the tray. The scent of cinnamon pulled him out of some empty space. "That looks good," he said softly. Ruth smiled, simple. "It was made with love, son. Want to try?" He picked up a mini pie, took a small bite, and closed his eyes for a second. It tastes like my grandmother's house in Arkansas. Good food always reminds us of those who loved us, Ruth replied quietly. The moment was delicate as powdered sugar, but the halls of the powerful don't sustain delicacy for long. A murmur spread through the room. Brandon Cole was arriving. Tall, impeccable, his presence commanded like a siren. He walked surrounded by partners and journalists. The music seemed to drop in involuntary respect. Ruth understood this was the moment to present the sample. She steadied the tray, stepped forward. The coordinator behind her gave a nod. Go. Mr. Cole, Ruth began, her voice steady. Good evening. I'm Ruth Williams. I brought the desert. An arm blocked her view, the head of security. Who authorized you to enter here? The voice was hard, trained to cut. The group around Brandon fell silent. The billionaire lifted eyes that measured people with invisible numbers. What's going on? She walked in with a tray. Someone answered, almost amused. Ruth lifted the tray slightly, as if offering peace. These are samples, sir, for the dessert table. Your team asked me to bring them into the hall. Brandon leaned closer, close enough to catch the scent of cinnamon, and ignore it. He looked slowly from the tray to Ruth's face, a short, cold smile. This is not a kitchen, he said, and his guests smiled as if watching live entertainment. Unauthorized people use the back door. The words hung in the air like a blade. Evan, only a few feet away, swallowed hard. He still tasted the sweetness of the mini pie on his lips and bitterness in his stomach. Ruth held the tray firmly. Her heart raced, but her gaze did not drop. Her manners tried to cover the wound that had just been opened. I was only following your team's request, sir. The coordinator at the back tried to step in, but someone held her. Let him handle it. Brandon took half a step forward. The whole room watched. The music seemed to stumble. Then respect the rules of this house, he said, weighing each syllable, and leave. A glimmer of a tear threatened but did not fall. She inhaled. The hall, the gowns, the watches, all shrank for a moment. Ruth slowly lowered the tray, as if sparing her heart from crashing to the floor. She glanced at Evan, who turned away, ashamed of something he didn't fully understand. And then, with dignity, she took her first step back. The camera followed Ruth exiting through the same door she had entered. Each step was a silent prayer. God, guard my tongue, guard my spirit. You know my worth. Before disappearing into the corridor, she turned her face once more toward the hall, not to ask for anything, but to mark within herself that the humiliation of that moment did not define who she was. The door closed. The music returned to full volume as if nothing had happened. But in truth, something had begun, and none of them realized it. The golden light of the hall gleamed on the polished floor, reflecting jewels, gowns, and the carefully constructed pride of the wealthy. In the middle of all that luxury stood Ruth, still holding the tray of desserts that had been prepared with trembling hands and sleepless nights. Every guest's eyes now rested on her. The silence in the room was heavy, charged with judgment. Brandon Cole moved closer, his tall figure towering above the modest woman. His words cut through the air with a sharpness meant to wound. He said that he did not recall inviting vendors into his party, and the sound of those words rippled like poison through the crowd. A woman dressed in diamonds whispered behind her glass of champagne that it was humiliating to bring someone like that to such an event. Ruth swallowed hard, forcing her voice to remain calm. She explained softly that she had only been asked by his own staff to deliver samples for the dessert table, that she meant no harm, no intrusion. Yet her explanation was not met with understanding, but with cruelty. Brandon raised his voice enough for all to hear, saying that people like her belonged in the kitchen, not standing among his guests. A few uncomfortable laughs broke out, others smiled with cold amusement, and still others lowered their eyes, unwilling to interfere. The tray in Ruth's hands shook slightly, but her spine remained straight. She thought of her children waiting at home, of the rent that needed paying, of her mother who always told her that dignity was something no one could take away. She tried once more, telling him that she had only wanted to share something made with her own hands. But Brandon looked at her with disdain, lifted one of her little pies between his fingers, studied it for a second as though it were unworthy of his table, and then let it fall back onto the tray with deliberate carelessness. The dessert broke, scattering crumbs across the marble floor. The sound was small, but the humiliation was louder than anything Ruth had ever felt. The guests gasped, some covering their mouths with the tips of their fingers, others shaking their heads but none stepping forward. Brandon gave a final command, telling his security to remove her from the hall before she embarrassed herself even more. At that moment a voice rose timidly, the voice of a young man who did not have the courage of his heart fully formed yet. Evan, the son of the billionaire, tried to say that perhaps his father was wrong, that perhaps she did not deserve this. But Brandon silenced him with a single look that spoke of power and authority, the kind of look that crushed rebellion before it was born. Evan lowered his head, his face burning with shame, and Ruth, seeing him, understood that not everyone in this room was made of stone. She breathed in deeply, whispering a silent prayer in her soul that God would hold her together. She reminded herself that she was not what they called her, that her worth was not decided by their glances or their laughter. With slow steps she began to back away, holding the tray as if it were a shield for her heart. Her dignity was the only thing she had left in that moment, and she would not let them strip it away. The security guard approached, but Ruth nodded as though she were leaving by her own decision, not by force. Her heels tapped against the marble, echoing through the hall, until she reached the heavy doors at the back. She turned her head one last time, not to plead, not to ask for pity, but to mark within herself that this humiliation would never define her. Then she walked out, and the doors closed behind her with a final thud. The room quickly swallowed the silence she left behind. Music resumed, laughter rose again, and the wealthy returned to their glasses of champagne as if nothing had happened. But among them, one heart had been shaken. Evan sat in the corner, unable to touch his drink, unable to forget the look of quiet strength on the woman's face. For the first time, he began to wonder if his father's power was built on something fragile, something deeply wrong. Outside the glittering mansion, the night air felt heavier than usual. The world seemed to move slower once Ruth stepped beyond the doors that had shut her out. The sound of laughter and music still echoed faintly from inside, muffled as though she had been exiled from a different universe, one where she had never truly belonged. She clutched the tray of desserts against her chest, though most of them had been ruined by careless hands. Her fingers pressed into the metal as if trying to keep herself from falling apart. Her feet carried her toward the narrow path that led back to the service gate, where deliveries were made, and where the unseen hands of the poor were allowed to touch the lives of the rich only in silence. She walked slowly, each step heavier than the last, her breath uneven. Her eyes stung, but she forced herself not to let the tears fall. She remembered what her mother used to say, "Never let them see you broken, because your dignity is the one crown no one can take from you." But tonight that crown felt fragile, cracked, ready to slip. She stopped near a quiet corner of the garden, where the lights of the party did not reach. There, hidden by tall hedges and shadows, she finally let the weight of her humiliation press down. A single tear slipped from the corner of her eye and slid across her cheek. She did not wipe it away. It belonged to her, and it carried the pain of every insult she had endured, not just tonight, but in years of silent battles. She had worked endless hours, raised her children alone, endured looks that pierced her skin like thorns, and still carried hope like a lantern inside her chest. But tonight, the cruelty of one man had almost snuffed out that light. She thought of her children waiting at home and of how she would explain why the money from tonight's job was uncertain now. She thought of her late husband, who had always told her she was stronger than she knew, and she wondered if he could see her now, standing in the dark, struggling not to collapse. For a moment she pressed her hands together and whispered a prayer. She asked God why people with so much pride and wealth felt the need to step on those who already carried so little. She asked for strength, for the courage to walk forward, and for the patience to believe that one day justice would find its way, even if tonight it seemed absent. As she prayed, another tear followed the first, and soon her cheeks were wet. She did not sob loudly. The pain inside her was too deep for noise. Her grief came in quiet tremors, in the stillness of a woman who has learned to cry where no one can see. Yet the silence of her tears held more power than the laughter inside the mansion. Because in that silence she was not defeated. She was wounded, yes, but she still stood, still breathed, still believed. And while she wiped her face with the corner of her apron, Ruth made herself a promise. She promised she would not allow the cruelty of others to harden her heart. She would keep cooking, keep working, keep loving, because that was who she was. If she stopped, then they would have won, and she would not give them that victory. As she walked slowly toward the small gate at the end of the path, her tears dried under the cool night air. She lifted her chin again, because she knew that dignity was not found in the approval of men like Brandon Cole, but in the quiet strength that comes from knowing God sees every injustice. And though she did not know it yet, her path was about to cross with fate, in a way that would shake the very foundations of the mansion she had just left. Back inside the mansion, the music had returned to its rhythm, and the golden lights danced over champagne glasses as if nothing had happened. The guests laughed again, pretending the moment of humiliation they had just witnessed was nothing but a small inconvenience quickly forgotten. But not everyone could forget. At the edge of the hall, Evan Cole, the only son of Brandon, sat quietly, his drink untouched, his mind racing. He had seen the look in Ruth's eyes when she was forced to leave, the way she carried her tray as if she were carrying her entire dignity on her shoulders. He had seen the way his father's words had cut through her, sharp and deliberate. And for the first time, the laughter of his world felt poisonous to him. A friend tapped him on the shoulder, a boy in the same expensive suit and polished shoes. "Come on, Evan," he said with a grin. "Don't sulk. Your dad was right. People like that don't belong here. They should be grateful they're even allowed near this house." Evan turned sharply, his voice low but trembling with something close to anger. She was just doing her job. She wasn't hurting anyone. His friend rolled his eyes and laughed. "You're too soft. That's why your father worries about you. You've got to learn how this world works." Evan felt his stomach twist. He hated that phrase, the way adults around him used it too, how the world works. As if cruelty and arrogance were the natural laws of life. He pushed the glass away and stood up, ignoring the confused looks of his friends. Across the room, Brandon noticed his son's restlessness. "Evan," he called sharply, his voice slicing through the music. "Where are you going?" The boy hesitated, his throat dry. "I just need some air," he said. Brandon frowned, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. "Stay where I can see you. Tonight is important." Evan nodded, but the weight in his chest grew heavier. Important for whom? For the men making deals in the corner, whispering about millions over glasses of wine? For the women showing off dresses that cost more than most families earned in a year? None of it felt important to him, not compared to the image of Ruth being humiliated just minutes ago. So instead of staying where his father could see him, Evan slipped quietly toward the side door. His footsteps quickened, his breath unsteady until the golden light of the mansion gave way to the cool night air. The stars above felt distant, but at least they were real, not polished illusions like the chandeliers inside. He walked down the long driveway, his thoughts louder than the music behind him. He remembered when he was younger, visiting his grandmother in Arkansas, where the house smelled of cornbread and the neighbors knew each other by name. There were no guards, no guests pretending to care, no father lecturing him on how to be strong by stepping on others. There had only been warmth, and food that tasted of love. Evan wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. He hated the way tears burned against the pressure to appear perfect. He hated feeling trapped in a world where his father's shadow defined every move he made. And tonight, with Ruth's quiet strength haunting him, he felt that shadow pressing heavier than ever. He whispered into the night, though no one was there to hear him. "I don't want to be like him." The words were sharp, desperate, but they were his truth. The road stretched ahead of him, lined with trees that rustled softly in the wind. The city lights glowed faintly in the distance, a reminder that outside the golden cage of his father's wealth, another world existed, a world that frightened him and called to him at the same time. Evan kept walking, his steps uncertain, his heart racing, not knowing where the road would lead but knowing he could no longer stay inside the mansion. Behind him, the sound of laughter faded into silence. Ahead of him, destiny waited. The night outside the mansion was quiet except for the distant hum of traffic and the soft whisper of leaves. Ruth walked alone down the narrow street, her tray empty now, her spirit bruised but not broken. She tried to steady her breathing, whispering prayers under her breath. She wanted to go home, to hug her children and tell them that everything was fine, even though her heart still carried the sting of humiliation. Far behind her, on the same road, Evan's footsteps echoed softly. He had walked further than he expected, his jacket pulled tight around him as if to shield him from more than just the cool air. His thoughts swirled with anger, confusion, and shame. Every word his father had spoken inside the mansion still rang in his ears, but louder than that was the image of Ruth's eyes. Sad, strong, and full of something he didn't understand, but wished he had. When Evan finally noticed the figure walking ahead, he hesitated. At first he thought it was just another passerby, but as he came closer, he recognized the same woman his father had thrown out. His chest tightened. He almost turned away, but something inside pushed him forward. Ruth heard footsteps behind her and turned slightly startled. She saw the young man, still dressed in the fine suit of the party, looking out of place on the lonely road. For a moment, suspicion crossed her mind. Why would the son of that man be here? But then she noticed the look on his face. Not arrogance, not mockery, but something fragile, almost desperate. "Ma'am," Evan said softly, his voice breaking the silence. He struggled with the words, not sure how to begin. I'm sorry. About what happened back there." Ruth stopped walking, her eyes fixed on him. She had expected cruelty, not apology. Her lips trembled before she spoke. "You don't need to say that, son. It wasn't your fault." "But it was," Evan whispered. His eyes dropped to the ground. "I should have said something. I should have stood up for you. But I didn't. I just stood there like a coward." Ruth looked at him for a long moment. She saw the shame in his shoulders, the way his hands twisted nervously at his sides. He was still just a boy, despite the expensive clothes, despite the name he carried. She softened her voice. "You're young, and your father's shadow is heavy. I don't blame you." Evan lifted his eyes to hers. "You're not like anyone I've ever seen at those parties. You didn't lower your head even when he tried to humiliate you. I wish I could be like that." Her chest ached at his words. She thought of her own son, not much younger than Evan, who also struggled to find his place in a world that often ignored boys like him. Ruth placed the tray down gently on a nearby wall and stepped closer. "Strength doesn't come from power, child. It comes from knowing who you are even when the world tells you otherwise." Evan swallowed hard. "I don't want to be like him. I don't want to live in a world where people are treated that way. But sometimes it feels like I don't have a choice." Ruth gave a faint smile, though her eyes still carried the weight of her tears. "There's always a choice. Even silence is a choice. Tonight you saw something, and it troubled you. That means your heart is still alive. Don't let it die." For a moment, neither spoke. The night wrapped around them like a fragile curtain, broken only by the sound of a car passing in the distance. Then Evan whispered, almost like a confession, "I don't even feel like I belong in that house. Not with him. Not with those people." Ruth nodded slowly. "Belonging doesn't come from walls of gold, son. It comes from the people who love you, who see you for who you are." She paused, her hand hovering as if she wanted to place it on his shoulder, but she hesitated, respecting the distance. "And maybe, just maybe, tonight you found the truth you've been searching for." Evan looked at her then, really looked, and felt something shift inside him. She wasn't just the woman his father had humiliated. She was the voice he wished he had. She was proof that dignity could exist even when stripped of everything else. Before Ruth could say more, the faint roar of an engine grew louder down the street. A car was coming fast, too fast for the narrow road. The headlights turned the corner, blinding them both for a moment. Ruth instinctively stepped forward, sensing danger. And in the blink of an eye, everything was about to change. The quiet road stretched before them, lined with shadows and silence, but that silence was suddenly broken by the distant growl of an engine. At first, Ruth barely noticed. Cars passed by this street often enough, and she was used to the careless speed of the wealthy who lived in the neighborhood. But something about this sound was different. It grew louder, angrier, like thunder rolling closer with no pause. Evan turned his head toward the curve in the road, his eyes narrowing. "That car's going too fast," he said nervously. His voice carried a tremor, and instinctively he stepped closer to Ruth, as if her presence offered protection. The headlights appeared, piercing the darkness like knives. The car came swerving around the corner, engine roaring, tires screaming against the asphalt. Whoever was driving had no concern for the quiet night, no thought of anyone walking along the road. Ruth's heart jumped. She grabbed Evan's arm and pulled him slightly back onto the narrow sidewalk. "Stay close to me, son," she said firmly, her voice steady though her chest pounded. But the road was tight, the sidewalk narrow, and the car was not slowing down. It raced forward with reckless force, weaving dangerously close to the curb. For one terrifying moment, Ruth realized that if Evan didn't move quickly enough, the car would sweep him under its tires. Evan froze. His eyes widened, his body stiffened. He could see the glare of the headlights flooding toward him, feel the vibration of the road shaking under his feet. His breath caught in his throat, but his legs refused to move. "Evan!" Ruth's voice was sharp, commanding, the voice of a mother who had raised children through storms of hunger and despair. "Move!" But Evan could not. Fear rooted him to the ground. The sound of the engine roared in his ears until it drowned out everything else. Ruth did not hesitate. Without another thought for herself, she pushed the tray of desserts aside, the metal clattering against the pavement, and lunged forward. She wrapped her arms around Evan's shoulders and pulled with all the strength she had left in her body. The car sped past, so close that the rush of wind tore at Ruth's dress and burned against her skin. For a split second, she felt the world tilt, the pavement rising up to meet her as she shielded the boy. They fell hard against the grass by the roadside, Evan underneath her, safe, trembling, but alive. The car didn't stop. Its red taillights flashed once in the distance before disappearing into the night, leaving behind only the echo of its reckless roar. Ruth's chest heaved as she lay there, her body aching from the fall. Evan's breathing was uneven, and his wide eyes searched hers with disbelief. You saved me," he whispered, his voice breaking. Ruth brushed the hair back from his forehead with trembling hands. "Of course I did. You're somebody's son." Her words carried more weight than she realized, more truth than Evan could bear. Tears welled in the boy's eyes. "But I'm his son," he said bitterly, the shame of his father's cruelty still hanging in the night air. Ruth looked at him with a gentleness that cut deeper than any reproach. "That doesn't matter. Tonight you were just a boy in danger, and no mother could watch a child suffer if she had the power to stop it." For the first time in years, Evan felt something he had almost forgotten, the warmth of being cared for, not because of money, not because of status, but simply because he was human. He clung to her then, his hands gripping the fabric of her dress, his shoulders shaking as silent tears fell. Ruth held him close, her own heart heavy but strong. She whispered softly, "God doesn't forget the weak, son. He sees, even when men pretend they don't." Above them, the night sky stretched wide and endless, as if heaven itself had witnessed what had just happened. Neither of them knew that this moment, the reckless car, the desperate embrace, the whispered words, would soon shake the walls of the mansion they had both left behind. Because by the end of the night, the truth of what Ruth had done would not stay hidden. The night air was still trembling with the roar of the car that had nearly taken Evan's life. Ruth's chest rose and fell as she held him close, her arms still wrapped protectively around him. She felt the thudding of his heart against her own, fast and frantic like a bird trapped in a cage. Her body ached from the fall, but her only concern was the boy's safety. "Are you hurt?" she whispered, brushing the dust from his sleeve. Evan shook his head quickly, though his eyes were still wide with fear. "No, I'm fine. You pulled me out just in time." His voice cracked, and he swallowed hard, as though admitting how close death had come was too heavy for him to bear. Ruth nodded slowly, relief flooding her weary body. "Thank God," she murmured, pressing a trembling hand to her chest. It could have been over in a heartbeat. They both sat there in silence for a moment, the world around them eerily quiet, as if even the night was holding its breath. The grass beneath them was damp, the coolness seeping into their clothes, but neither moved. Evan leaned against her, unwilling to let go of the safety he felt in her presence. Then Ruth's ears caught something, a faint rumble, distant at first but growing steadily louder. Her heart sank as she realized it was the same reckless car, circling back down the road. The driver had turned around. Whether out of arrogance, thrill, or sheer madness, they were coming again, faster, louder, more dangerous. Evan stiffened as the headlights reappeared in the distance, cutting through the darkness like a predator's eyes. "They're coming back," he whispered, panic lacing every word. Ruth's instincts flared. She gripped his hand tightly. "Listen to me," she said firmly, her voice calm but urgent. "When I say run, you run. Don't look back. Do you understand?" Evan shook his head violently, tears filling his eyes. "No, I can't leave you. They'll hit you." Ruth cupped his face with both hands, forcing him to meet her gaze. Her eyes glistened with both strength and sorrow. "You have your whole life ahead of you. You must live, Evan. Run and don't stop until you're safe." The roar of the engine grew louder, the headlights swelling brighter. Time seemed to slow. The car swerved recklessly, its tires screeching as it charged straight toward them. "Run!" Ruth shouted, pushing Evan with all her strength. He stumbled to his feet, his legs clumsy at first, but then he bolted down the road, his heart pounding like a drum. He looked back once, just once, and what he saw burned itself into his memory forever. Ruth stood her ground. She knew she didn't have the strength to outrun the car, not with the driver so determined, not with the distance so short. But she planted her feet firmly on the ground, raising her arms in a desperate attempt to shield Evan. The headlights swallowed her silhouette, the roar of the engine deafening. At the very last moment, she threw herself sideways, hitting the car's hood with a force that sent her spinning to the ground. The vehicle screeched past, swerving wildly, before disappearing into the night once more. Dust rose around her, and for a terrifying instant, everything was silent. "Ruth!" Evan cried out, his voice shattering the night as he ran back toward her. He dropped to his knees beside her, his hands trembling as he touched her arm. "No, no, no, please, God, no." Her body was bruised, her breath shallow, but her eyes fluttered open. She forced a weak smile, her hand reaching up to touch his cheek. "You're safe," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "That's all that matters." Tears streamed down Evan's face as he held her hand tightly. "You didn't have to. You could have died." Ruth's gaze softened. A mother's heart doesn't measure the cost when a child is in danger. Whether you're mine or not, you're still someone's child. And God gave me the strength to protect you tonight. Her words wrapped around him like a shield, stronger than any wealth his father could buy. He bent his head, sobbing into her hand, clinging to the woman who had risked everything for him, even though she owed him nothing. The night stretched on, heavy and still, and though Ruth's body ached with pain, her spirit shone brighter than ever. She had given all she had to give, and in that sacrifice, she had planted a seed that would soon change everything. Because this act, the courage of a humble mother standing against death itself, was about to be revealed in a way that no one in the glittering mansion could ignore. Inside the mansion, the music swelled again and conversation returned to its polished rhythm, but Brandon's patience thinned with every passing minute. He scanned the room, searching for his son, and when he did not find him, an old anger flared. He signaled to security with a curt wave, and the captain approached quickly. Brandon asked where Evan had gone, and the man answered in a low voice that the young master had slipped out through the side doors. The answer struck Brandon like an insult. He demanded that they locate him at once, that they cover the driveway and the street, that they make sure no cameras caught anything that would embarrass the family tonight. The guard nodded and hurried away, relaying orders into his earpiece. Brandon pulled his phone from his pocket and dialed his son. The call rang, and when it finally connected, his voice came out hard. He asked Evan where he was and told him to get back immediately. On the other end, there was only breath and a tremor he didn't recognize. Evan said he was on the road, that he needed air, that something had happened. Brandon cut him off, telling him this was not the time for dramatics, telling him to listen for once in his life. Evan's voice cracked then. He said that a car had almost hit him. He said the woman from the desserts had pulled him away. Brandon froze, not sure he had heard correctly. Evan repeated it clearer now, as if forcing his father to swallow the truth. "The woman you humiliated saved me." The words landed like a blow. For a moment, Brandon didn't move, didn't speak. Around him, the party kept dancing in gold and glass, but the world inside his chest tilted. He demanded to know where they were. Evan gave him the street, his voice breaking again, and said she might be hurt, that she had been hit on the hood, that he didn't know how bad it was. Brandon didn't wait for more. He pushed through the crowd, ignoring the hands that tried to stop him with questions, and strode to the front door. His driver scrambled after him. Security peeled away from the walls and followed as the front gates rolled open. The limousine and a security SUV shot down the long drive and out into the night. Brandon sat forward, one hand braced on the seat, the other clenched around his phone. He wanted to blame the boy for running off, to blame the guard for losing sight of him, to blame the city for being what it was. But the accusation stuck in his throat. The only image that filled his mind was the face of the woman he had dismissed as if she were nothing, walking out with her tray and a straight back. He pushed the thought away and told the driver to go faster. They found them near the curve where the street lamps grew thin. Evan stood over someone on the ground, waving his arms wildly as the headlights approached. Brandon stepped out before the car had fully stopped. He heard his son call his name, and then he saw her, Ruth, lying in the grass, her dress torn at the shoulder, her breath unsteady, her hands scraped raw, her eyes open and searching for the boy's face. The tray was bent in the gutter, and near it a small card, wrinkled but legible, read the simple promise she had brought to his door. "Dochuras de Ruth, feitas com fe." Brandon's feet hesitated, as if pride itself were an iron chain. Evan grabbed his sleeve and pulled him closer. He said, "Look at her, Dad. Look at what she did for me." The boy's voice broke into a sob. He said, "She saved my life." The confession rang through the night with a purity that made every excuse sound cheap. Brandon knelt, the grass wet against the knees of his suit. He reached for Ruth's wrist, not sure what to say or how to hold the weight of the moment. The questions he asked came out practical because he had nothing else to offer. Could she breathe? Did her ribs hurt? Did she hit her head? Ruth nodded faintly and said she was all right, that the boy was what mattered, that God had been merciful. She didn't look at Brandon long. Her eyes kept returning to Evan, as if counting his breaths. Security circled the street, one man speaking into his radio for an ambulance, another scanning the road where the car had disappeared. A neighbor opened a gate and called out that she had seen the car fly past twice, that she had already dialed 911, and that help was on the way. Brandon answered with a thank you that sounded unlike him. He fumbled for a second, then slipped off his jacket and tucked it under Ruth's head to keep her away from the cold ground. The gesture shook him. He realized how little he knew about tenderness when it couldn't be bought. Evan knelt on the other side of Ruth and told her he was sorry, that he should have moved, that he had frozen, that he didn't deserve what she had done. She reached up with a trembling hand and touched his cheek, telling him softly that fear comes for everyone, that courage is just love moving faster than fear, and that any mother would have done the same. Her voice was faint, but unbroken. Brandon listened, the words collecting inside him like stones. He tried to speak, but what came out first was the same language that had built his entire life. Control, command, procedure. He told security to shut down the street, to make sure the ambulance had a clear path, to get the license plate of the reckless driver from any camera on the route. Then he looked down at Ruth again, and his voice softened almost to a whisper. He said he had been wrong. He said it without defense, without a single polished word to dull the truth. He told her he had no excuse for how he had treated her, and the apology sounded small against the night but real, in a way his money never was. Ruth closed her eyes and breathed in, a careful breath that seemed to weigh the sincerity of what she heard. She didn't answer him right away. A siren was rising in the distance, and she turned her attention back to Evan, asking if he was dizzy, if he could stand, if he felt any pain in his legs. Evan insisted he was fine and said she needed a doctor more than he did. He asked if she could hold his hand until the ambulance came, and she said yes, of course, and their fingers laced like a promise. The ambulance swept around the corner, lights flashing blue and red across the quiet homes. Paramedics spilled out with crisp efficiency, asking questions, checking pupils, running practiced hands along bruised bones. One of them listened to Ruth's breath and told her they'd take her in to be safe. Another asked who she was to the family, and Evan answered before anyone else could, saying she was the woman who saved him. The medic nodded with the solemn respect given to people who use their strength at the exact second the world needs it. Brandon asked if he could ride along. The paramedic said they had space for one, and Evan turned to his father, torn between guilt and need. Brandon placed a hand on his shoulder and told him he was coming, that they would both go, that tonight nothing else mattered. He swallowed, then faced Ruth and said that he would take responsibility for her care, that the best doctors would be called, that he would cover everything. Ruth met his eyes and answered quietly that care was welcome, but that debts of the heart are not paid with checks. She said it without bitterness, only with the clarity of someone who has learned what truly heals and what only masks. They lifted her onto the gurney, securing straps with gentle hands. Evan climbed into the ambulance and sat beside her, refusing to let go of her fingers. Brandon stood at the open doors for a heartbeat too long, as if staring at the distance between who he had been an hour ago and who he might have to become. Then he stepped inside. The doors closed, the siren cried out, and the ambulance sped toward the hospital, drawing a bright line through the dark. Behind them, the mansion still glowed, but its light felt hollow now, like a lantern with no heat. In the quiet wake of the ambulance, a truth settled over the street and over Brandon's heart alike. The woman he had thrown out as if she had no place in his world had just given his world back to him, and there would be no returning to the man he was before he knew it. The revelation was complete. The reckoning was next. The ambulance carved a bright path through the night, and when it reached the hospital, the world narrowed to white halls, quick footsteps, and the clean bite of antiseptic in the air. Ruth was guided into an exam room, her breathing steady but guarded, her eyes following Evan as if counting his blinks for reassurance. Brandon stood a step behind them, a powerful man suddenly small in a place where money could open doors, but could not rewind minutes. Doctors and nurses moved with practiced calm. They checked pupils, pressed gently along her ribs, murmured to one another in short, efficient phrases. The diagnosis came like careful rain: bruised ribs, deep contusions along the shoulder and hip, a mild concussion to be watched through the night. Nothing broken, no internal bleeding. She would ache for weeks, but she would heal. The nurse smiled at Evan and said the words he needed most: "She's going to be okay." And the boy let out a breath that sounded like gratitude and relief stitched together. Brandon thanked the staff quietly, and then turned to Ruth, but the words in his mouth felt like foreign currency. Heavy, cold, not much use where he now stood. He tried to begin with logistics, because logistics had always steadied him. He said he would cover her care, bring in specialists if needed, arrange a private room if she preferred it. Ruth listened, her eyes gentle but clear, and answered that care was appreciated, but kindness was the first medicine she had needed tonight. The reminder bent something inside him that pride had kept locked for years. Evan pulled a chair close to the bed and took Ruth's hand, holding it as if it were a rope that kept him from drifting into the fear he had just tasted. "I should have moved," he said, voice low, almost ashamed. She shook her head and told him softly that fear is a fast tide, that love just had to be faster, and tonight it was. He swallowed and nodded, his fingers tightening around hers. Brandon stood, watching boy and woman, his son and the stranger he had made an enemy an hour before, bound by something he could not buy, schedule, or control. He cleared his throat, and the first honest words of his night finally came out thin and unarmored. He said he had been wrong. He said he had treated her as less than human. He said he had no excuse. He said he was sorry. The apology hung there, not noble, not rehearsed, simply true. Ruth studied him for a moment that felt longer than the drive from the mansion. "Words matter," she said, "but the way you carry them tomorrow will matter more." There was no bitterness in her voice, only the plain truth of a woman who had worked for decades and learned to measure character in actions, not promises. The automatic door at the end of the hall opened and closed, and with it came the rattle of the other world pushing back in. Brandon's phone lit up on the chair he'd abandoned. It buzzed again and again until the vibration seemed to climb the walls. Messages stacked from board members, publicists, old friends, newer enemies. In the space of minutes, the party's golden cruelty had spilled past the marble and into every pocket screen in the city. Someone had filmed the scene in the ballroom. The video now traveled faster than the ambulance ever could. The caption was simple, brutal, unforgettable. "Billionaire humiliates Baker. Minutes later, she saves his son." His publicist finally broke through with a call he could not ignore. A voice that had always sounded assured now shook with urgency. The clip was everywhere. Sponsors were calling. An anchor wanted comment by sunrise, and the phrase pattern of concern, apology, proactive steps kept repeating like a metronome trying to set the tempo of a storm. Brandon listened, but could not look at the phone while Ruth lay in a hospital gown and his son clung to her hand. He ended the call and placed the device face down, as if laying a mirror on its back. Evan spoke first, not to accuse but to name what had happened. "You hurt her," he said, eyes red, voice steady. "Not just tonight. You hurt people like her all the time when you talk the way you do." The words did not come from rebellion. They came from the place that had just learned what grace looked like in a stranger's arms. Brandon didn't defend himself. He sat down, the chair complaining under the sudden weight of a man at last heavier with truth than with position. "I know," he said. "I know now." He looked at Ruth, not away. "I believed my rules protected something worth protecting, but my rules protected my pride." Silence settled, the kind that doesn't suffocate but clears the fog. A police officer appeared at the door with a notepad and a voice that softened when he understood who was lying in the bed. He took statements, asked for the direction the car had gone, jotted down the neighbor's earlier call, promised camera pulls from street corners by morning. When he learned who the boy was, he nodded and said quietly that the law would be the same for whoever had driven that car, and for a moment the room felt level, like a field after the plow. The officer left. The nurse adjusted Ruth's IV and told her to rest. Evan laid his head near Ruth's arm, the posture of a child at last safe. Brandon stood, then sat, then stood again, as if his body had not yet learned how to behave without the scaffolding of superiority. He tried to speak and stopped, then tried again. "If you will allow it," he said. "I want to make this right in ways that don't end when the cameras get bored." Ruth's eyes softened but did not surrender to easy absolution. "Right begins at the front door," she said. "The way your people are greeted, the way your kitchen is spoken to, the way your son sees you respect those who serve you. Start there." He nodded like a student. He said he would open the accounts he kept closed, that scholarships could be seated in her name, that community kitchens could be funded and staffed with living wages, that the supply chains that fed his parties would be rebuilt to honor the hands behind the plates. Ruth listened and lifted a gentle palm. "Build those things," she said, But don't call them repayment to me. Call them what they are, repentance. The word was old and clean, and it landed with the quiet authority of a sermon whispered straight to the conscience. Tears stung Brandon's eyes. Tears he did not permit even at funerals. He lowered his head, not performative, not for any lens, only because the floor was the first honest place he had found to place his gaze. I will, he said. I will begin tonight. Evan raised his head, searching his father's face for the first sign that this was not just another pivot, crafted to survive scandal. He found something raw there, something uncertain, and therefore real. Then let people see it, the boy said. Not a press line, a confession. In the same room where you shamed her. The suggestion stretched the space between them. The idea of walking back into that hall, not as a king but as a man, came to Brandon like cold water. He nodded once, small and final. Tomorrow, he said. I will ask her permission, and if she agrees, I'll do it there. He looked to Ruth, and the question sat open. Will you allow me to make this right in the light where I sinned in the dark of my pride? Ruth closed her eyes for a moment, then opened them to the two faces watching her. One that had just risked losing everything, one that had nearly lost his life. If you are going to change, she answered, do it where the damage was done. But remember, the apology is not the finish line, it's the starting gun. Brandon exhaled, and with it years of practiced hardness seemed to thin. He reached out, then checked himself, then placed his hand lightly over Ruth's fingers. Careful, grateful, restrained. Thank you, he said, and the words for once sounded like they meant what they said. The night deepened beyond the windows, and the hallway quieted. A volunteer brought blankets, the nurse dimmed the lights, and the beeping machines fell into a sleepy rhythm. Evan dozed in the chair with his hand still in Ruth's. Brandon sat across from them, a guardian finally learning what it meant to guard. His phone buzzed again. He didn't move. Out there, a clip was still multiplying, headlines were still writing themselves, and people were still choosing sides. In here, something more important had already been decided. Pride had cracked. A different man could grow through those fractures if he kept choosing it, one humble step at a time. And as the first thin line of dawn began to imagine itself beyond the city's edge, a plan waited quietly for morning. The doors of the mansion would open again, but this time the richest thing inside would not be the chandeliers. Morning broke with a pale light, washing the city in silver before the sun rose fully. Inside the hospital, Ruth stirred awake, her body aching but her spirit calm. Beside her, Evan slept with his head against the edge of the bed, his hand still clutching hers as if afraid that letting go would undo the night. Across the room, Brandon sat in silence, his suit wrinkled from hours of wear, his eyes red but open. He had not left her side, not once, though the world outside screamed for his attention. By sunrise, the video of the ballroom humiliation and the story of the late-night rescue had spread beyond the city. News anchors spoke her name now. Strangers who had never tasted her pies repeated it on television, on radios and online posts. Ruth Williams. A mother, a baker, a woman who had been mocked in gold-plated halls and yet had thrown herself in front of a speeding car to save a life that wasn't even hers to protect. The story had all the pieces of a parable, and people leaned in to hear its ending. Brandon's publicist called again at dawn, pleading for a statement before markets opened. But Brandon had already made up his mind. He told the man simply, "There will be no statement until Ruth is ready. This is not about me anymore." The silence on the line spoke volumes. For once, power was not being wielded but surrendered. By afternoon, Ruth was discharged. Bruised, slow in her steps but determined, she agreed to return to the mansion, not to serve, not to be humiliated again, but to stand with dignity where she had been wronged. She said quietly to Brandon, "If you mean what you said, then let the truth come out where the lie was told." And he nodded, humbled, knowing this was the price of repentance. When the evening came, the mansion's doors opened once more. Not for a glittering party this time, but for a gathering of guests staff and reporters who had heard the story and wanted to see the truth unfold. The chandeliers still shone, but they felt dimmer, as though even the light itself had been waiting for this reckoning. Brandon stood before them all, no champagne glass in hand, no polished speech written by a team. His voice trembled at first, unused to honesty spoken aloud. He said, "Last night in this very room I mocked a woman who came here in good faith. I treated her as though her presence was unworthy. In my pride I thought myself higher than her. But hours later, that same woman risked her life to save my only son. The shame of that truth will never leave me, and it should not. But I pray that the lesson will never leave me either." The room was hushed, the kind of silence that listens not out of politeness but because hearts are leaning forward. Brandon turned, his eyes searching for Ruth. She stood at the edge of the room, steady, wearing no jewels, only the quiet strength that had carried her through the night. He gestured toward her and said, "This is Ruth Williams, and from this day she will never again walk through the side door of my house. She belongs at the table, not because she saved my son, but because she was always worthy of respect, and I was too blind to see it." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some bowed their heads, others wiped at their eyes. Even the staff in the shadows, maids, servers, cooks, lifted their gazes, as if the chains of invisibility had cracked a little. Ruth stepped forward slowly. The eyes of the wealthy fell on her again, but this time she did not feel small. She lifted her chin and spoke, her voice warm but firm. "Respect is not a gift you hand out when it suits you. It is the right of every soul, no matter their wealth, their work, or their skin. Last night I cried alone in the dark because of the way I was treated here, but when I saw your son in danger, I did not think of your words. I thought only of the child in front of me, because love does not ask for permission to act." Her words landed like a bell tolling through the mansion, clear and undeniable. She did not raise her voice, but it carried more weight than any speech of power ever could. Evan moved beside her then, his young face resolute. "She's right," he said. I froze. I could have died. But she gave me a second chance, and she gave me something else too. She showed me what strength looks like. It's not in money. It's not in fear, it's in love. His voice broke, but he did not look away. I don't want to be who I was raised to be. I want to be more like her. There was a stillness in the hall. The chandeliers sparkled faintly, but for once, they did not outshine the people beneath them. Brandon lowered his head, his pride finally shattered, and said with all the sincerity he had left, "God forgive me. And Ruth, if you can find it in your heart, forgive me too." Ruth looked at him for a long time, the memories of the night playing behind her eyes. Finally she answered softly, "Forgiveness is not mine to hold back, but change is yours to live." The guests bowed their heads, some whispering prayers, some whispering promises to themselves. And in that golden room where arrogance had reigned only 24 hours before, the weight shifted. Not because wealth had been lost, but because humility had entered where pride once ruled. Outside the mansion, the night sky stretched wide and unbroken. Ruth walked away slowly, Evan at her side, her steps steady despite her bruises. She knew life would not suddenly become easy. She knew there were still battles to fight, still hearts in the world hard as stone. But she also knew something unshakable. God had seen her tears, and God had turned her humiliation into honor. And as the story spread beyond the mansion's walls, people whispered it like a modern parable, that the proud will stumble, and the humble will rise. That a woman once mocked for her place in the world had shown the world what true worth looked like. That justice delayed is never justice denied, because God does not abandon the just. Have you ever been humiliated and thought no one saw your pain? Remember Ruth. Remember that dignity is never defined by the proud, but by the truth of your own heart. The world may laugh, but God sees. And when the time comes, justice will shine brighter than gold. Never lose hope. The good will always triumph in the end.